This is the Triratna Dharma training course for Mitras. Compiled by Vedanya and produced by Sangaruchi. Music by Sarvadarshan. Hello, my name's Sangaruchi. This course is usually offered in Triratna Buddhist centres to small groups. I'm producing an audio version for anyone who can't get to a centre. Please listen to episode 1.1.0 as this gives an introduction. The course is narrated in text sessions, and in a subsequent question and answer session, I respond to anything people have sent me. Do send any questions. Year 1, Section 1, Week 7 of the Dharma training course for Mitras. 1.1.7 Questions and Answers. The Buddha made it clear that he considered whatever helps human beings to transcend their present limited state as Dharma. Does this mean that children's stories are Dharma? That's a curious question. I suppose by that definition, it kind of does. Yeah. Educating kids and telling them about the world, I suppose on that level, is trying to bring them into a more mature and more sophisticated and more emotionally responsible relationship with their experience. Broadly speaking, yes, I suppose that is. I think if somebody said the word Dharma, I doubt that they would be trying to communicate to you that they want to tell you a children's story. So sort of technically, yes, but in practice, probably no. I think the Dharma is usually related quite specifically to spiritual growth. Exactly how you might define that would probably vary, but I would say most children's stories are about social growth or psychological growth or maturity on the sort of general biological level that sort of gets you into the human realm. I think real spiritual growth probably requires a degree of agency that particularly young children I don't think have. I think you need to be able to make quite a sophisticated level of choice to be a Buddhist, for example. I don't think you can be made a Buddhist when you're very young. I think it's quite a nuanced thing. Question 2. I generally feel quite satisfied with my life. Could working towards an even more satisfying life be an even better aim? So I presume this means a better aim than trying to avoid suffering. I mean, possibly whatever works for you. There is something quite particular about suffering that has a very direct urgency to it. Like, suffering is actually a lot more of a compelling motivation than pleasure generally is. You know, a lot of people come to the Buddhist centre and they might stop drinking, get some more satisfying friendships and get a general sense of well-being. And then often people sort of wane after that point. Most people don't last too much longer than a couple of years. I think there's a bit of a thing where most people, after a couple of years of practice, they can largely get rid of the really major unethical action and the really big psychological problems that they have. and pain isn't as wholly pressing to them. And a lot of people just leave it at that and sort of make do with a manageable amount of pain. Sort of when the intense pain has stopped, there's not really that much more of a motivation. I think pain really does demand a response. In most situations, if I offered you something pleasurable, you might be able to take it or leave it. But if you were being tortured, or if you were being exposed to a lot of pain, I think it would take a much bigger jump to resist the end of a painful experience than the start of a pleasurable one. I remember a friend telling me some time ago that he had root canal work done, and he said that the experience of that really got him to think about whether basing his life on pleasure and pain really was worth it, because he sort of says he's always after biscuits and other sweet treats, and he gets some amount of pleasure from that. But he said that having root canal work was the equivalent in pain of about 250,000 biscuits. If someone had said to him, I'll give you root canal work and you can eat 250,000 biscuits, that would have been on parity, which is a lot of biscuits. And so he said that he deduced from that the amount of pain that is possible to experience compared to the amount of pleasure, it's just not a good thing to base your life on, which is quite a curious reflection. Another way of putting it is if you're in a nice warm bed that's got cotton sheets and there's another bed a mile away with silk sheets, you're not going to make that journey for something a little bit more pleasurable. Whereas if you're sleeping in a stinky, soggy bed that's cold or, spiky or something like that, and there's any other bed that's a mile walk away, you're probably going to do it. So yeah, there is a reason why pain in particular is stressed, and I think that is because it is so compelling. I suppose that's the method of the stick. There's the carrot and the stick, and Buddhism definitely has both. Reflecting on the faults of samsara is a traditional practice, but also enjoying meditation, the sensory experience of meditation, bringing your attention to kindness, bringing your attention to images of the Buddha and bodhisattvas, getting to know them, associating with decent, kind, wise people. It's just pleasurable. It's just like an innocent and positive pleasure that I think is pretty much essential. What is existential suffering? Existential suffering, likely in contrast to psychological suffering or physical suffering, is the pain that you inevitably experience when you exist. The word exist comes from sistiere. Sistiere means to set up or cause to stand, and ex means apart. So to exist, the word exist doesn't mean that something has been created. It means that something has been broken off and set apart. So existence is taking the entirety of the universe and you break a little bit of that off and set it aside, and that bit exists. You now exist. You are now set apart from. When you separate yourself, when you separate the universe, in fact, into self and other as fundamental categories, so we're not talking about separating self and other as just words or as useful terms, that's perfectly fine. But setting a part of the universe aside, these certain feelings, these certain thoughts, these certain limbs and sensations, and this particular bank account. And as soon as you do that, there are a load of characteristics that come with that. Existential aloneness, for one, that you are impinged upon by everything else that is not you. You can't get away from the rest of the universe, and you can't control the rest of the universe. That's an inevitable result of doing that. That you have desire, that you have hatred, that you have ignorance, that you are subject to death, that you are subject to a body. There are certain things that come from your existential situation. And these are distinct from psychological suffering, which is suffering that's particular to you, that you have a personal desire for those particular shoes is a psychological suffering, but the fact that you are subject to desire at all is an existential issue. Often psychological suffering comes from its root in existential suffering. I mean, even something like getting impatient at the traffic lights when the lights are on red. That is something that's particular to you in this particular situation. But when you really think about it, the only reason that you would be annoyed that this is taking up time is because you're going to die. I mean, that if you were an immortal and time meant nothing to you, red lights just wouldn't matter. Like, it just wouldn't be an issue. So often the particular psychological and physical and practical and emotional suffering that we have in the moment, it's psychological, but it comes from an existential base, let's say. It can all be traced back to the fact that we're mortal. But it just comes out in different ways in different people. Isn't it the case that desire for things sometimes does bring about satisfaction? Most definitely, yeah. If you act on the desire and you get the thing that you do desire, or adversely, you manage to get rid of the thing that you hate or are aversive to, then you become satisfied. And if you could do that without fault, indefinitely, forever, that would by far be the best option. So desire, hatred and ignorance are definitely plan A. I would recommend giving them a go, as fully as you possibly can, and seeing if they work for you. But the difficulty with desire is it's a bit like feeding a child sweets. Their appetite grows every time you do it. And every time you allow desire to dictate your actions and control your attention and ultimately get what it wants, your desire will become a little bit bigger. It will become a little bit stronger. So the first thing about desire in that sense is, even though it is satisfying in the short term, it has a tendency to snowball. The other thing is the satisfaction that we get from satisfying a desire or acting on a desire and getting the object that we desire. Is it the pleasure that we seem to get from it? Is often actually not directly pleasurable when you really look at it. It's a bit like if you have an itch and you scratch your skin really hard. There's a pleasure in doing that. But if you actually come into contact with the sensation, it's actually quite painful scratching yourself hard, and it can damage your skin. And so it's relatively evident that the pleasure is not from the scratching, because if it were from the scratching, you'd be scratching yourself all the time. You'd be scratching your skin raw if that sensation of scratching was actually pleasurable. Scratching isn't pleasurable It's that you no longer have the itch. You no longer have a desire for that to be gone. So I suppose in some ways, desire and aversion are the same thing, because every time you desire something, you have an aversion to something else. And in this situation, you are desiring the sensation of a scratch because you are aversive to the sensation of an itch. And so the pleasure of getting a desire satisfied is only pleasurable in contrast to the misery you were in beforehand. And so the insinuation is it's better just not to have the itch at all. How do you know which desires are craving or healthy desire? In some ways, this is a question of a lifetime, really. Being able to accurately know the difference between the two is really important. I can't think of any canonical or particular method of doing that. I suppose for myself, most of the time I kind of know. There's a sort of little voice of conscience that comes in. And if I just want something, as long as I'm not very distracted, I usually kind of know whether it's a good idea or not. And often it's mixed. So it's often around food, because I do actually need food. Do I need food with that higher sugar content? Probably not. But I need something to eat, and that's kind of there. And so it kind of is to some degree a healthy desire and to some degree not. And the motives are always mixed. And it's not like you have to be a sergeant major breathing down your own neck. I think it's important not to get uptight about this and be micromanaging everything you do. In some ways, what can underlie that is a craving for control, which is a sort of more fundamental process that can go on. So you're sort of technically you're being a good Buddhist, but deeper down, you're highly attached to a dogma or a sense of controlling your environment or yourself for a sense of security. Like it's quite complex. But all that I sort of wouldn't worry too much about. When relating to desire as part of the Four Noble Truths, I think the most important thing is to go through them in sequence. There are Four Noble Truths, and they are in a particular order for a really good reason. You've got to start at dukkha. You've got to look at the things in your life that are pressing you and that you want to resolve. So 2 examples of this. I used to have a lovely collection of hats. I had captain's hats and I had bishop's hats, and these were like actual proper hats. They weren't fancy dress. I'd actually got the real thing second hand, and I'd got all these hats and I really loved them. And when I become a Buddhist, I got the idea that craving and desire and having objects was a bad thing, and I got rid of them all. I just got this idea that desire was bad and things were bad, and I'll get rid of them. But it was totally disjointed because they just made my life a little bit brighter. Sometimes I'd sit around with my mates and we'd all sit in the living room and put a silly hat on, and it was just kind of a nice little thing in life that was pretty harmless, quite spontaneous. And it put me into a situation that I now actually regret. There was no need to do that. It was fine. The other example went through the whole sequence more fully, and it started with dukkha. It started with pain. And for me at this particular time, it was a pain of a sense that the world was quite shallow, that my interactions with people were really unsatisfying. And I had lots of views at that time that it was other people that were like that, of course, because that was best to blame it on. everybody else who's not spiritual and who's not this and who's not that and, you know, is not as deep as me or whatever it happened to be. But even regardless of trying to blame everyone else, the pain continued. It felt like a fuzzy wall between me and everybody else. And for one reason or another, I decided that this was because I was telling lies. I mean, they weren't massive whoppers or anything, but it was just kind of embellishing everything, and everything I said was just a little bit different to how it happened. I didn't really convey things the way they happened. I sort of dramatized them, let's say. And I also avoided saying what the truth was if I needed to say something difficult, if I didn't like something that was happening. I often backed off from that. And so that desire to embellish the facts that I thought would make things more exciting and hide from the difficult truths that I had to say, I suppose that was aversion, really. Continually giving in to them, I thought that that might have something to do with the situation. And so I decided just not to do those things. And for quite some time, I wasn't able to execute that plan. It took quite a few tries of giving it a go and not doing it at all, and then giving it a go and doing it a bit, and then talking to people about it and keep talking to people about it, telling them what I was trying to do. And eventually it did sort of come out pretty well. Well, certainly well enough for me to notice that my relationship with people was changing. For me to have a deep conversation, I needed to be deep. I can't rely on the world or blame the world for that happening. But in that instance, it kind of worked out well because it come from a real genuine sense of dukkha. I wasn't changing my behaviour or what I was doing based on some ideology. It was based on a real lived sense of a problem in my life. And I'm going to try to do this thing for a while, and I'm going to observe whether it makes a difference to the suffering. Because in a way, that's all you've got. The only motivation that we've got is to avoid suffering. And that goes for whether you are totally behind plan A, which is greed, hatred, and ignorance, or totally behind plan B, which is awareness, compassion, and wisdom. Both of those are to overcome suffering. They're just very different strategies to overcome suffering. And that really is what we're motivated by. You know, wanting to be a good boy, or wanting to be seen as kind, or because everyone else is doing it, or because we think we should. It's just not good enough. It's not a compelling enough motivation. You've got to link it to a lived sense of suffering. I heard a phrase, cherish the dukkha. What does this mean? I don't know exactly. I don't know who said it and in what context, but I would probably say that this is a contextual view that can be useful. You know, dukkha is the thing we're trying to overcome, so you don't want to create dukkha. But at the same time, the entire motivation for a spiritual life comes from dukkha, in just the same way as the entire motivation for greed and hatred and ignorance comes from dukkha. Yeah, like I say, it's so easy to be motivated by wanting to be a good boy, or, you know, because everyone else is doing it, or, you know, we should be doing this or should be doing that, or, you know, you end up meditating by rote or by habit, and then after a while you have no idea why you're doing it. It's just not good enough to maintain any kind of prolonged practice. But in the instances when you are in direct contact with unmitigated dukkha, sort of the kind that you're just subject to, I find it can certainly force me into a deeper mode because I can't solve it. I just know by looking at it that I can't solve it on a shallow level. You know, bereavement, breakup, severe illness, physical pain, betrayal. I remember as a kid, my granddad died, and I knew instinctively that the mechanisms through which I would normally get what I want, which was, you know, crying to my parents or distracting myself with games or going to play with my mates or whatever it was, my usual strategies, my worldly strategies were not going to touch this. And I prayed. It was the first and possibly the only time in my life I've prayed. And although nothing come of that in a theistic sense, the predicament that I was in meant that I had to go deeper, meant that I had to look for a spiritual solution to this, because there is no way in hell I was going to find a worldly one. I once heard someone who had endured the most extreme abuse as a kid, and they'd sort of completely blocked it out, but it was coming up in their adult life and they were remembering it, and they were in serious agony trying to come to terms with it. But it was very curious that this person admitted that although it was terrible and she would never wish it on anyone, she had to grow. There was no other choice. She said the only other choice was to go insane. She had to take responsibility for her mind in a way that she'd never had to do before. And so Cherish the Dukkha is not the wish for anyone to be abused or not the wish for anyone to experience pain. I'd say it's an encouragement that whatever pain you are in, if you can feel it, if you can face it, if you can turn towards it, you can come out the other side as someone who is more capable of moving through reality. You can't have compassion without pain. Someone mentioned to me recently a bereavement that they had. A friend said to them, you need to capitalize on this. You know, when you're in that kind of pain and in that kind of loss, it's easy to think when crisis comes along to get into the doing mode of how can I fix this problem? And some situations can convince you that they can be fixed. But some problems, when you're faced with them, it's more about how can I learn from this?